And you see this again and again and again around the world where governments, they may not really want to hold on to a territory so much, but they're worried that if they permit the secession of that territory, then all the others are going to see that, and it can have this cascade effect. You even see it in the language of leaders around the world. So one of the other problems then with the United States is the core 50 states are all equal. And so permitting the secession of one can lead to a big cascade effect and really the dissolution of the country. And knowing that, well, that's going to shape the preferences and the reactions of the central government. So those are all practical circumstances that I think create big obstacles to secession in America.
America is divided because our powerful federal government pits red states against blue. We need to return power to the states and to the people by decentralizing. If that fails, we must be prepared for a peaceful national divorce or face a destructive civil war. Welcome to War, Divorce, or Federalism. America at a crossroads.
Ryan D. Griffiths is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. His research actually focuses on the dynamics of secession and the study of sovereignty. He has numerous books and articles related to secession and national divorce, the most recent of which is The Disunited States, Threats of Secession in Red and Blue America and Why They Won't Work, published in August of this year. Professor, welcome to WDF, War, Divorce, or Federalism. Very happy to have you on.
Thank you, Rick. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm interested, so interested. I've read some of the arguments. I'm happy to have kind of a back and forth and a different opinion. I want to be fully educated and enlightened on what the pros and the cons are of these secession ideas. And I also want to talk to you about some of the things that have come, I guess, into the popular realm of social media, like soft secession, this term soft secession. But to get started, your book and your studies, in fact, you have extensive studies globally about secession movements and the ins and outs of those and the tendency toward violence. Did you find in those studies, in your previous books, that directly caused you to come to a conclusion that a peaceful divorce, national divorce, or a peaceful secession in the United States is not possible?
It did, yeah. So my background on this, as you said, I've written a number of articles and books going back about 15 years, and I focused on the study of secession globally and historically. I hadn't really focused on the United States except as a case. Or a set of cases. And I just gradually became more and more aware of the kind of growing secessionist sentiment in America over the last 10 years. So one of the things that I've written about, I talk about it in the book, The Disunited States, but that's based on these other books that I've written. First of all, secessionism, there's plenty of secessionist movements in the world. Depends on how we count them. You know, do you need a certain amount of people or 3 guys in a bar sufficient to be a secessionist movement, et cetera? Secession is where, you know, an area of a country wants to break away and become its own independent sovereign state, recognized. It rarely works. In most cases, it fails. And half the time, it turns violent. So it's a very difficult process for a number of reasons. One of the things that I write about and talk about in the book is that where it does work peacefully. Now, there are plenty of cases where a state emerges. You know, the most recent successful case was South Sudan in 2011. Successful case of secession. However, that was not peaceful, right? That's after decades of violent conflict with Sudan. But where you get peaceful secession, it tends to occur in very specific circumstances where you've got a very clear population, like nationally defined, self-identified, maybe they're distinct in some way, linguistically, racially, religiously, etc. They are regionally concentrated, a clear majority in the region that they claim, and that region has a very clear border, right? An administrative line separating it from the rest of the country so that all can agree on where borders should be drawn. And then finally, that the region that they claim has some special status, some special administrative status that is, agreed upon by all the relevant actors. And like, well, okay, for that particular region, they're kind of a nation apart. And if they secede, that is not a right that should then be extended to the rest of the country. And so they have a special administrative status. When that happens, you can get peaceful secession, but those circumstances are fairly rare and they become more rare with time. And so those are lessons that or some of the many lessons I've drawn from earlier work, and then applying them to the United States was trying to argue that regardless of whether these arguments are right or the righteousness of these causes, in practical terms, a peaceful secession or national divorce in America will be very difficult to pull off.
Let's talk about that a little bit more, because of course the reasons could be, I mean, I've heard arguments that would be more moral or more legal, but you're focusing on the practical. And so I'd like to dig into that a little bit more. What are the practical reasons as you see them on why a peaceful, because I think that's what we're getting at is the argument could be made like, sure, of course you can have a civil war, a national divorce that's violent. But if the argument is, can it be done peacefully or not? And you're saying that there are practical reasons that it can't happen in the United States. Can you give us a little bit more on that?
Absolutely, absolutely. So let me just backtrack a little bit and sort of describe the way that secession works out internationally. All right. In an earlier work, I called this the sovereignty game, and it works. It kind of goes like this. You have right around 193 independent sovereign states in the world. Those are the full UN members. And they behave like a club where being in that club has real benefits. There's very, serious benefits to being in that club. And I can understand why you'd want to join it. But getting into the club requires that the club members accept you. And there's a fascinating application process I'm happy to chat about. So let's say New Hampshire declared independence and said, we are going to apply to the United Nations. And you can Google the United Nations website to see the process, right? An application would be tendered. And a key thing that the existing club members do is they assign a great deal of priority to the wishes of the home state from which the secessionist movement wants to secede, right? So in the case of New Hampshire, that would obviously be the United States, which is a member of the club. And if the home state doesn't agree to it, then it is very rare for the rest of the international community to ignore their wishes and go ahead and recognize that secessionist movement. So what that means then, there's a strategic game that all secessionist movements have to play, which is they need to try to work through their home state and get them to agree to a referendum, agree to their independence. And they can do that through coercion, through persuasion. They can try to bring in the international community on their side. It's a very difficult game, and the tactics vary depending on the setting you're in. What works for Catalunya is different from West Papua, which is different from Tibet. But it's a very difficult process, and most cases fail, right? And partly that's just the way that the international system currently works. It's not a question of right or wrong, but just the way the system is designed. And so there's a status quo bias in international politics. So that's the main reason. But let me just break apart. In the Disunited States, I talk about two basic types of secessionist movements in America. There is the national divorce concept that is gaining some currency. Marjorie Taylor Greene has tweeted this periodically. There's the Red State America group. And what they do is they imagine a division of America into a red America and a blue America. And in the book, I call them, as a shorthand, Red Land and Blue Land. I argue that is going to be incredibly difficult because the populations are just fundamentally intermixed. And trying to unmix those populations, and there's chapters I discuss potential maps with which you could do it, is going to be a very difficult, tortured process. But there's a second type of movement in America that more people are familiar with, which are regional movements, right? Texas, yes. California, New Hampshire. They're state-based, and there's a problem where even none of those states, of course, have a clear majority, right? Even Texas is just barely red, and there's millions of people who would not want to be in, an independent Texas, et cetera. But let's say for a minute, right, we'll run with New Hampshire. That New Hampshire, the desire for independence got so high there that you had 60% polling pro-independence. That would be extraordinary. It still puts a fundamental problem to America, which is that the central government, if it agrees to those terms, to a New Hampshire independence or even a referendum, that is tantamount to saying to every other of the 49 states, the juridical equals, that you also have that right. And what governments are very wary of is giving up territory, but also setting a precedent. And you see this again and again and again around the world where governments, they may not really want to hold on to a territory so much, but they're worried that if they permit the secession of that territory, then all the others are going to see that, and it can have this cascade effect. You even see it in the language of leaders around the world. So one of the other problems then with the United States is the core 50 states are all equal. And so permitting the secession of one can lead to a big cascade effect and really the dissolution of the country. And knowing that, well, that's going to shape the preferences and the reactions of the central government. So those are all practical circumstances that I think create big obstacles to secession in America.
Right. I see the argument for being accepted in the club internationally is going to be very difficult if there was a rogue action by California. I think about California and Texas primarily. It could be New Hampshire, it could be Alaska, it could be, Florida, but those two California and Texas seem to be best poised to actually try and affect some sort of secession because of their GDPs, their economies, the fact that they have military bases and so forth. But, and I know you've had an interview with Mr. Evans of CalExit, and the argument that he would make is, and we're not going to dig in too deep on the legalities, but on that Texas v. White, the clause is unless the other states agree. And he would say, okay, look, if California wants to leave and all of the red states hate California, they're going to agree, yeah, let California leave. So in theory, I agree with you. The United States as a national entity would never willingly agree to let a state go. And that makes complete sense. And as you've said, your other studies internationally would reaffirm. But with this clause of this sort of federal system that we have, if you did indeed have other red states saying goodbye, California, wouldn't that in essence then be saying to the international community, yes, the United States are agreeing with and letting California leave? Wouldn't that take care of the concern about not being recognized?
Absolutely. Yeah. So you're referencing the Supreme Court decision from 1869, right? Texas v. White, where they decided, and it's a fascinating case, it really is. They decided in a 5-3 decision that secession is unconstitutional. And the tagline is, they said, that a state cannot secede unilaterally. It's an indissoluble union. That's their language, except unless the rest of the country agrees to it in different language or through revolution, which is a weird caveat. But but the condition that if the rest of the country agrees to it, that's basically the saying that the country gives its blessing. And that is that, a similar understanding exists around the world, and it's consistent with what I said earlier about the Sovereignty Club. So let's say California really pushes for independence. It tips up. Gavin Newsom champions a secessionist movement, California, et cetera. And they have a clear majority, right? They show in a referendum, an overwhelming majority. And then the national government and a majority of states agree to that. Yeah, I think that is a peaceful secession. And I'm not arguing that would be, I think at that point, California would be independent. I'm just saying that getting to that point will be very, very difficult, right? That would require that all of the other, or a majority, there's a voting rule on that, of states would agree to it, that the national government would agree to it. And just to highlight two problems that I already mentioned, by agreeing to that, the United States, there's no way they're going to sit there and think this issue is going to be contained to just California. You can imagine that, I know the Texas nationalists would say, behold, look at this. Now this is our opportunity. What happens to Oregon? What happens to all these other movements? And, whoever's in the White House will be quite aware of that. Then you've got the problem of what happens inside of California. All those millions of people who say, I don't want to be in the new Democratic Republic of California. I want to break away. What happens to Fresno and these other counties? So there are so many practical issues that get in the way of that peaceful division, and that's what I'm really trying to highlight in the book.
Yeah, I get that. And some of these arguments, I guess, that you'd be making is that it's not literally impossible, but the events that would lead to it are so unlikely successively that it renders it effectively impossible. Is that fair to say?
That is right. I never use the word possible. I don't think it's impossible at all. I think one thing I do say, though, is that it would be very, very difficult to pull that off without conflict. All right. For a simple reason that, and I have a chapter in here that walks through the attempt to disintegrate, to disassemble America, the type of ideological hardening that would set in, right? Just the issue of, all right, let's say California is going to become independent. Surely there will be people in California, mayors or congressmen and women who will say, all right, we want to have a vote to decide if we should be able to remain in there. Then you're going to have local referenda that try to determine that, right? Then what happens to neighboring counties in Nevada or Oregon and the rest of the cascading effect? So to have that pulled off in a peaceful, harmonious manner, I think, is utopian thinking. I think that it'd be very difficult to pull off, and I think secessionists need to be aware of that, or people who are pro-secessionist for whatever reason, I think need to be aware of the practical difficulties.
I want to get back to Texas v. White very briefly. I'm just kind of curious. I've read, I'm certain you've read the opinion and the dissenting opinion, which was pretty blistering. Given the timing of the opinion relative to the Civil War, the pressures, the question of Justice, Salmon Chase and his previous loyalties and so forth, do you think that if a case was brought to the Supreme Court now that looked at that decision, that they would come to the same conclusion? As I know it's just wild-eyed thinking, but I'm curious in what you think of that.
Yeah, I mean, I like you. I think the case is fascinating. I mean, I have a chapter on this. It's the most technical, but in my mind, the most fun chapter to write. Okay, so to the question, if this were brought again to the Supreme Court, I don't think this would be overturned. I think that I'll say this, I think they made the right decision, but for the wrong reasons. That's my view on it. But I don't think that in the year 2025, or let's say that the year 2030, that they would casually overturn that. I think they would see that's the precedent. There isn't a particularly strong reason to want to overturn that. Now, maybe changing composition of the Supreme Court could alter this, right? But the notion that, if you and I were having this conversation in 1868, right, the idea that states have a right to secede would seem more salient. Or if we had this conversation in 1850,
yeah,
like we'd be like, yeah, I'm not sure that's a problem, right? We might have disagreements on it. But in the 21st century, it doesn't seem like there are very few people who make that argument unless they're secessionists or on a particular side of that constitutional debate. So no, the answer to your question is, I don't think it would be likely. I don't think it would be overturned.
Yeah. Might be like an NFL football game where looking at the replay, you could argue each way, but to overturn the ruling on the field, it has to be very clear cut. Yeah, I don't know. I find that so interesting. I'd like to get to one of your other significant arguments, especially with the red land, blue land division, the two-state solution. That seems pretty unworkable, and I certainly don't disagree there. I mean, it's such an intermixing. We don't have clear geographic division. We don't, as you've said before, there's not really clear-cut cultural identity divisions, although maybe we could start to say this ideological hardening could, in fact, sort of work into the same sort of mindset as if there were two truly different cultures in some of these other countries that you've been studying. But the idea that you separate and you've got these enclaves, these more urban enclaves that are, we'll say, blue inside red states, and how do you divide all of this? I don't disagree with you at all that that's very difficult. Once you start to get more regional, it seems like it might be slightly more workable. But the idea of having these islands of people who feel like they don't belong there, that they need to leave, they need to exit. I forget how you phrase it, but there needs to be a migration, kind of like a Pakistan and India, although it would be voluntary. So that's totally different. But when I look at the overall problem of polarization and in the United States and how we're interacting with each other and how we're hardening ideologically, the only solution I can come up with is to give greater state sovereignty, reduce the power in the federal government to kind of ease things off, take the pressure down. But in that circumstance, I don't see that that's any different when it comes to the people. So say Texas has a lot more state sovereignty. You still have the people in Austin who aren't happy with Texas. So the concern of people who feel like they are not well represented in their state doesn't change. Can you address that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Again, it gets at a problem that you have an interspersed population, right? I live in a purple suburb, right? My neighbors are Democrats and Republicans or moderates. And it's important to remember, too, millions of Americans are really moderate and independent. I think that gets lost in these conversations. But as for solutions, I mean, I know this is one of the things you're interested in. I do think that defending federalism within the current constitutional limits is a great thing. The state should definitely defend what the Constitution entitles them to, right? The long-term trajectory of America is toward a centralizing state, and so it's important to try to maintain that federal system. And the federal system does work quite well. It doesn't work perfectly. I know that. But I guess my answer to your question would be a different answer than what you're seeking, which is that there's no question in my mind. The current impetus for secession, whether it's red or blue, liberal, conservative, is frustration with polarization, right? That is the catalyst. That's what is injecting these movements with energy. And over the last 10 years, I was talking to these movements 10 years ago, and they seemed there was a lot less wind in their sails than what I see now. In my view, the real solution, and this is the point I try to make in the book, is that you have to go after polarization. There are all these solutions out there. I have colleagues who work on this. We know about clear solutions that people agree with across the political spectrum, like how to draw congressional districts. That's a great way to dampen polarization in Congress. We know it works. There's just not the political will to do it. So my solution is really to go after to do these fixes that are meant to dampen polarization. I'll say this too, which is I don't think this is a one-way street, right? Polarization can go up and down, and maybe we'll have a conversation in 20 years and I'll say, Rick, I was wrong. This was a horse that was unhinged and you were right, or whatever, that polarization was not going to turn around. But I think that is the thing to go for. But let me return to maybe the spirit of your point, which is, would a solution of increased federalism, right, or increased decentralization work? I mean, I guess that would have to be done through some kind of constitutional amendment or series of amendments or series of laws that don't amend the Constitution, that try to grant the states greater rights. Perhaps those things could help. There is a danger of pushing too far. And I think a lot of folks who think about these questions have a picture in their mind of a confederal America, where you really create a much more decentralized political system where the states are almost their own independent states. In my view, that seems very difficult to pull off for many of the same reasons that I think secession is difficult to pull off. You have intermixed populations, et cetera. I think if you began to push that too far, though, then you're probably beginning a process, might be long-term, quite long-term, of American fragmentation. Once you begin to really empower states, you give them an international identity that looks like a sovereign state, I think that you're changing what America is at that.
And then that answers a question that I was definitely wanting to ask you, is that this idea of what some call radical decentralization, or a truer federal system, whether that takes the temperature down or whether it's a step toward fragmentation, and you've just answered fragmentation. So that really, I just would like to dig into this more with you, because I think you and I both recognize there's a major issue in the United States with polarization and the inability to be civil to other people. And again, I'll go back to, I think it stems from a strong central government, a national government, and why me in North Dakota cares about whether California is able to redistrict. Well, it's because, then they have a stronger voice in DC, and then the policies that they like will then affect me. And, you can play that for any state, red, blue, conservative, progressive, doesn't matter. But the idea is that we states are clamoring to control DC. And because we want to control what our lives look like, what our government looks like that controls us directly, we necessarily have to control all of the people in all of the other states with such a strong federal government. So if we try and take that down, I'm trying to figure out if taking the temperature down would require greater sovereignty, but greater sovereignty leads to fragmentation. What's your answer?
Yeah, I mean, my answer, I think it proceeds from a slightly different diagnosis of the problem. I agree that the long-term trajectory of the United States is toward a stronger center relative to the units, right? And we know this historically.
Mm-hmm.
But I do not see that the central government as the prime catalyst of polarization. Honestly, I wouldn't even put it in the top. I just don't see it as the prime catalyst. If you went after, for example, so you gave the example of, for folks in parts of Minnesota, right? You could be in a small town or you could be in Minneapolis. And why should we care about the electoral districting going on in California, right? That's a California problem. I read that as not so much an issue of political centralization, but of the polarization in the government, in Congress, right? And the fact that you have factions that, and we see these graphs that maps the electoral voting of the members of Congress over the last 60 years. And they're about as far apart now as we've seen since that polling began, right? Now, people want to compare when were we last this polarized, and that's hard to say because polls are different and they changed over time. But maybe the 1920s or the Gilded Age or the Civil War era. So I see polarization as a huge problem. I think that, and you can look at the way the media transmits these things. So, when you and I grew up, I don't want to make any assumptions about when you grew up, but I know when I grew up, local news was a bigger deal. I grew up in Southwest Florida. I don't think I barely knew about any news in California and other places like that, unless there was a wildfire. It was local news that really mattered. And now people focus a lot more on national news than local news. The media sphere, as we know, is really, I go to the gym in the mornings and I'm on my treadmill and I can see one TV of Fox News and the other of CNN, and they're in different universes. So these are problems that feed those sorts of issues, and I think they are much more pronounced and a bigger problem than the central government. So I think addressing those is really a great way to try to dampen the problem of polarization. And I think the central government, I think you don't want to have too strong a central government, but there are benefits to giving it some strength, right? But imagine a year 2025 in a parallel dimension where the central government is just as strong as is now, but we have a remarkably non-polarized society. So whoever that president is in the White House, whether they're Republican or Democrat, they're very moderate. They have a cabinet that's bipartisan, right? And that kind of bipartisan spirit extends across state legislatures, right? Then I think these issues that we are assigning to the over-centralization of the government just wouldn't exist. You'd have a much more functional government that is dealing with real political, kitchen table type issues that we care about.
That's very interesting. I don't necessarily disagree with you. However, I would suggest that scenario is just as implausible as what you're suggesting the division or the fragmentation is, a peaceful divorce is. I don't know any solution that's been proposed on how we get people that are less polarized in offices elected, that will actually go and do the work instead of be fighting for red or for blue at the expense of the American people. That seems even less likely than a peaceful divorce.
Well, what if, just to give one example, and it's one that I think has been in the news in recent times, is the way that districts are drawn. There is no secret here. There's no mystery to how this can be done. People have explained how you can have commissions that use algorithms to draw new districts based on the census. And it's done in a way that doesn't account for each voter's, political party. And it designs rational districts for all 50 with a 2 across California, or, et cetera. And so the districts are drawn in a way, and it fixes the gerrymandering problem. And so then those more rationally drawn districts are going to select for more moderate candidates, because the contest is not going to be at the primary level then. It's really going to be at the general election level. And so you're going to need moderate candidates to win. So I don't know the districts that well in Minnesota, but I think in your mind of a very blue district or a very red district. And if those were drawn in a way that weren't gerrymandered, and I don't know if they are in Minnesota, I don't know, but we know that there are plenty of gerrymandered districts, then it's going to be harder for a radical liberal or a radical conservative to get elected. That then changes the composition of Congress, where you're gonna really decrease the number of particularly radical Democrats or radical Republicans, more centralized people who are going to come across the aisle, and then it's much easier for them to agree to moderate policies. And a lot of polls show, and these are many polls. Like, I don't think this is that controversial, that Congress is more polarized than the average American right now. It's not truly representative. So one fix that political scientists talk about all the time is how you draw districts, right? And that one, I think, is it's not even like only people on the right see it or only people on the left. Everybody sees it. That just the political will doesn't exist, and that's partly because congressmen and women have a vested interest in the way their districts are drawn right now. So that's going to take political will to fix.
Yep. I would like to see the states come up with laws that would be something as simple as any district must be a polygon of not more than X number of sides, I mean, something really simple. It'd be great if you could just say a square, but I mean, obviously that's not realistic. But yeah, this gerrymandering, certainly I agree with you. It definitely contributes. I think it's a lot more than that. I think there's, if we could get back to the founding fathers' vision of a much weaker executive branch nationally, that would help. I certainly understand why people on the left are extremely concerned about Trump's actions from the executive branch. I can understand why people on the right were concerned about some of the overreaches by the Biden administration, so on and so forth. So if Congress wouldn't abrogate its responsibilities and would actually do its job, if executive branch was contained to where it was supposed to be, a lot of these problems would go away. But again, how do we get there? It's just so difficult. So what I come to, and I think I'm hearing somewhat in your answers that you might agree, let me know, if there's this sense of a pendulum swing. Depending on who's in office, who's in power, the left or the right is more inflamed, more agitated, calling for secession, calling for national divorce. But then the other party gets in, they calm down, and it just seems to go back and forth. My concern is that the intensity is increasing over these last several years and may continue to increase, such that the pendulum may swing, but it's getting so intense that at some point there's going to be a breaking point. I was very concerned when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, whether that might escalate things to a point of no return. Do you agree with this sort of pendulum that is just this calming effect? And do you agree with the growing intensity? And then the last part of that is, are you concerned if there's growing intensity that there might be a point of no return?
Yeah. So I would say that depending on who's in the White House, to use the pendulum, imagery that you're talking about, I think that is accurate. So when Biden was in the White House, that inflamed more conservative elements of America across a set of issues. Now that Trump, or when he was previously, and now that he's back, that obviously inflames more liberal elements of America. I think that does that just in gross terms. But where secession is concerned, which is just a minority of that larger pattern, you definitely see it. So you've talked to people in CalExit, and you know that during the first Trump administration and the second, well, that helps CalExit, right? That kind of, it energizes their movement. The same happened for the Red State America group, or it happens for the Texas Nationalists as well, although the Texas Nationalists are a little more moderate. I mean, they're on the right, but it's a bit more moderate. But they get energized by having, had Kamala Harris won, that probably would have helped the roster for the Texas National. So you have that pendulum problem, and that's dangerous. And it's something I do talk about in the book, because if you can't fix this underlying polarization problem, and an issue where secession is concerned, as you keep alternating in the White House, you're going to energize the other side, and then it swings over there and it energizes more leftish or rightish type movements, depending. Interestingly, though, those movements, I think, as you know, are also connected to one another, right? So even if the goal of the Texas Nationalists is to be independent, they definitely get energy from a Democrat in the White House. But in a weird sort of way, they get energy from having Donald Trump in the White House as well, because it leads to more polarization. And if California gets energy, then Texas, these groups are to some extent friends, they're allies, because they have a similar interest in, which is independence. But there was, and the final question you asked there, Rick, do I worry about where this goes? Absolutely. Right. So let me just say that I do think and this almost comes down to faith on my part. I do think that America will get its act together, and gradually the issues of polarization will subside. But that's partly as much based on faith as just sheer analysis. Do I worry that if this continues, right, what happens? And surely there are limits to what America can take. Any country has its limits. And if you push enough and you generate enough secessionist energy, there are limits. And some of these limits are identifiable. For example, if one of these movements in America suddenly got a very prominent politician behind them to champion that cause, that's a game changer, right? If you have a failed election where neither side is going to accept it, and you get complete political deadlock where democracy seems to have just stopped, that's a game changer. So there are these thresholds, and we can look around the world and see them. One of the movements I've studied is in Catalonia in Spain, and their movement between 2006 and 2014 tripled in support, went from about 15 to 45% of the population that became pro-independent. And one of the injections was when the president of Catalonia, that's like the governor, if you will, a guy named Artur Mas, joined the secessionist cause. He got so frustrated, he's finally like, fine, and he joined the secessionists, and that galvanized support. It brought in his political party. So those are key moments. And to your question, there are limits to what the country can take.
Yeah. Do you find in your studies, do you see patterns or specific metrics that in these secession movements that point to higher risk of violence or lesser risk of violence? And then with those metrics, how would you overlay that on the circumstances in the United States?
Yeah, so if I look at in the broader studies I've done, and this is very data driven with a lot of interviews and stuff like that, I'd say there are two good predictors of where you'll get conflict. One is the level of democracy. We're in a democracy, right? So movements that take place in a highly institutionalized democracy very rarely get violent, right? So if you think about Scotland or Quebec or Catalonia or Flanders, et cetera, right? And the reason, and let's compare them with Kurdistan or West Papua, or places that a lot of maybe the listeners won't be as familiar with, but they exist. There are nearly 100 of these movements. If you and I, Rick, are running a secessionist movement and there is a democratic structure around us, then tactically it just makes sense that we're going to try to get elected to office. We're going to try to put Rick Becker in the governor of whatever municipal region we're in, and use the electoral apparatus to get what we want. And that pushes away from violence. When you've got secessionist movements in places where those democratic structures do not exist, or they're unstable, right, then the movement that you and I started might be forced to turn to other tactical options like violence and terrorism and things like that. So one is, in a democracy, it tends to push secession towards nonviolent methods. However, it rarely works. Because what happens is democracies convert secessionist movements into what I call in the book democratized movements, where they fight hard to get elected and win a majority, for the simple reason that democracies where you have good democratic structures, you usually have a wealthy country with good services, and it's hard to win over a majority in those kinds of places. And so the Scots could only get 45% because the other 55% thought, I don't know, pretty uncertain. Do we really want to do this? What's going to happen to our pensions? What's going to happen to oil? What about, are we going to be on the pound? I don't know. But if that had been a war zone where they were oppressed, it'd be an entirely different thought experiment for them. So one thing is when you're in a democracy, it tends to push secessionist movements towards peaceful methods, but it doesn't make them more likely to get to the promised land of independence, right? The other thing is when, well, this kind of gets at a question I had earlier, when you've got a movement that exists in a very special setting, right, where they have a special administrative status, they're unique, the borders are drawn, and they push for independence, then you might get some sort of peaceful independence. So the great example is what's called the Velvet Divorce. That's when Czechoslovakia, you and I are old enough to remember them, right, split into two countries, and it was easy, because you had a country that was really binary. It had two parts, the Czech part, the Slovak part. They had an internal border separating them. Two languages, somewhat different. And so when they decided to split up, there wasn't a precedent-setting problem for them, all right? Let me give you an example from the United States. The best case, actually, of a peaceful secession in the United States is probably not what you're thinking. It's Puerto Rico. Because Puerto Rico is not an independent sovereign state. It's called an unincorporated territory. It's an associate state of America, but it is juridically treated completely different, right? It's basically been given authorization to be independent if it wants. If the majority of Puerto Ricans want independence, they just don't. But if they did, and Puerto Rico said, look, Washington, D.C., we want to have a referendum, they're much more likely to get it because they're not Florida, they're not New York, they're not Minnesota. And if Puerto Rico becomes independent, it's not the case that Texas or California or New Hampshire are going to say, hey, they got it, what about us? Because Puerto Rico everybody agrees that it's different. It's at a different administrative status. And there's no reason to think that what is given to Puerto Rico should be given to the other 50 states. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is you often can see a lack of violence in precisely those circumstances where the region is unique. When you don't have it, and you also don't have democratic structures to channel the methods, then I think violence becomes far more likely.
I understand. Yes. When I look at some of these movements, and which you're an expert on, and let's go back to your recent book. Forgive me, I forget the title, but about the pre-colonial states and then how they shrank into a decreased number of states, and then now with decolonialization, we have more states. Did you find in your studies that there was an associated loss and then regaining of freedom? Because I know in the Disunited States, you question the pro-secessionist concept of greater freedom with smaller polities. Did your studies in these other governments and historically sort of underscore that pro-secessionist sentiment, or does it dismantle it?
That's a good question. So I think you're getting at, does secession, where you suddenly have a smaller political unit, does that make for a more free or a better society in some sense? Is that kind of the
it is, and I'm trying to find the parallel, and it's different when you're talking colonialization because you have sort of a master concept. But I'm assuming that in your studies, these smaller nations had greater freedom before they were colonized, and then probably had increased freedom once they were decolonized. And I'm wondering if there's a parallel there at all with the fact that they were smaller and then part of a greater nation and then once again smaller.
Yeah. I mean, just in general, it's hard to make the comparison with the process of decolonization with the United States. Just because so many, I forget the number, but it's maybe 70 or 80 new independent states, something like that, emerged from decolonization. In many ways, they're better off for sure, because they're no longer a subject of France or what have you. But that doesn't mean that the society that emerged is also super harmonious, right? There's lots of problems, many of them stemming from colonization in the first place, or just the way that the artificial constructions. But I think getting to the question about if does secession often lead to better designed countries because they're smaller, maybe the political preferences are more homogenous, that kind of thing. This is one of the arguments I talk about in the book that secessionists make, right? That smaller is better. I think and the answer is that it's a mixed bag. There are plenty of cases where you had a secession into a smaller political unit and it's a basket case. It's just not working. And there are examples where it became quite small and it thrived. The great success story is Singapore, which is actually not even secession. It was really expelled from Malaysia. So Malaysia became independent of British colonization, and Singapore was lumped in with it. And then it was expelled. And the early leader, Lee Kuan Yew, was seen on TV crying about this. But then they got their act together and they became what we know of as a thriving state. But there are plenty of cases where you get a smaller unit, and it's South Sudan, the most recent one, right? They probably won many freedoms by not being a subject or whatever, being a part of the rest of Sudan, which is culturally different, etc. But now South Sudan has struggled for the last 14 years and has its own internal conflict. So it's not an easy fix. And I think it's very context based. Yeah.
Some of these other nations, I think we would all agree, have strong moral justification for wanting independence or to secede. Would you say that, say, CalExit or Texit folks, their problems that they have with the federal government, that they quite simply do not rise to the level of a moral justification for secession or creating their own state?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll be cautious here. I really try to, both in the U.S. and definitely studying abroad or different movements abroad, to try to be, do justice to what people want. Look, I think there are two very prominent arguments, moral arguments, normative arguments that secessionists make. All right. One is called a remedial right. That's usually when you've got a group that is oppressed, the victims of human rights abuse, genocide, something like that. And you see this in West Papua, right, which is a movement I'm quite close to in Indonesia. And basically the idea is the social contract is broken. The government is not treating them as they deserve. So a remedy, thus a remedial right, is for them to be free and independent, right? That's one argument. And I think that's a very good argument. I don't think that holds in the United States. It doesn't usually hold in democratized settings because, and this isn't to diminish the aspirations of folks in New Hampshire, California, or Scotland or Catalonia, but they don't face the same type of oppression as you're going to get in West Papua or Bougainville or the perimeter of Myanmar, right? You just don't. And I think they would accept that for the most part. So there's that normative argument, and I do think there's a place for that. But try getting governments around the world to agree to that. The second one, and this is the one that is more common in America, is sometimes called a primary right. It's a more democratic, it's kind of a John Locke kind of idea, which is that if a group is concentrated, right, and they have a territory, shouldn't they have a right to vote through some sort of referendum or plebiscite about what their state should be, right? Mm-hmm. Isn't that what it's all about? That's what the social contract is all about. This is an argument made by the Catalans and the Scots, and it's certainly made by the Texas nationalists too, and it's understandable. I also think that's a good argument to make. My only caveat with it is that you need to set that bar pretty high, meaning that you can't have a group, I live in Syracuse. It shouldn't be the case that the municipality of Syracuse should be able to call for a referendum every Tuesday where all they need is one more than 50% to be independent. That's too destabilizing. Preferences swing so casually, so easily. It's problematic. So I think a primary right, although a good thing, right, there's pros and cons of it. The pro is that it really authorizes people to choose their fate, and I understand that. The downside is it can be quite destabilizing. So you probably need to set that bar quite high and set conditions about the frequency in which those referenda can be agreed to. I don't have a magic number for you. And there's a lot of literature on this. Some people say there should be 2 votes. One that needs to be above 60%, and then another vote, some years later, cooling off, or they vote again. Or some people say the rest of the country needs to vote on the issue, or it can only be done once every 10 years. Those rules are hard to work through, but the spirit of them is to say we honor what the primary right is all about, but you need to set the bar high. Otherwise, it's going to be hard to have a functional society.
When it comes to a threshold for that moral righteousness, the idea that any rational person can say, okay, here we are. I do agree with this desire for secession, desire for self-determination. Whether it's, let's say, CalExit and Trump, let's say Newsom gets in next time and Texas versus Newsom, is there something, and the rhetoric is certainly increasing now, is there something Donald Trump could do? And you can, whatever president, whatever state, is there some, but I'm just going to go with current. Is there something Donald Trump could do at this point that you would say, wow, I now agree that California has made not only the moral right, but perhaps the moral obligation to proceed with attempting secession? Is there something that you see as a threshold?
I mean, so a personal threshold for me, is that what you're, that
Yeah.
I don't know. I would have to imagine a very difficult set of circumstances that are almost conflict based, right? Where California, the government has been, well, lack of a better expression, no pun intended, trumped by the federal government, right? And they're deactivated in terms of the power. National Guard is in some sort of set of circumstances where it's clear that the situation is fully broken. And then at that point, you're kind of getting at what I think is that remedial right? At that,
Yes.
the social contract is broken. The remedy then is for some sort of independence. Identifying that threshold where I would agree to it is quite hard. It's not hard. I would need some time to really begin to think about it. I'll say this though. I don't think what I see out there is pretty far from that, right? I see issues in America that concern me. There's no question. And polarization concerns me. And I think it's an issue that the United States needs to fix. But I'm nowhere near the point where I think that these regional groups, their right to secession is now activated on account of the behavior of the government.
Yeah, it's something that will probably sort of dissipate here, but very recently with Donald Trump talking about the death penalty for elected congressmen who are telling the military members to not follow orders that they see as unlawful. I mean, that's an incredible escalation. I mean, to me, it's just shocking. Now, I think maybe people are sort of not alarmed because it's Donald Trump and his tendency for this sort of hyperbole. But in and of itself, President of the United States saying something like that and members of Congress advising members of the military to not follow orders. I mean, if this doesn't dissipate very rapidly, we are headed down a path, I think, of no return.
Yeah. So what the path of no return is, I don't know. I do think it's farther out, but that's not because I'm right or have better information than you. A lot of that, as you know, comes down to our own kind of subjective assessments. There is that problem, as you just pointed out, that a lot of this rhetoric is new to Americans, but we often kind of dismiss it because that's just Donald Trump saying Donald Trump kind of things. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, if those acts are followed through, like, somehow they're actually, you're arresting leaders or actually shooting them or something, that's different. I mean, that's a big difference. And at that point, honestly, I think, Rick, probably a bigger cause of concern for me is actually a conflict, some sort of civil war, but it's not just secessionists. It's more about, there's a distinction that Civil War scholars make between secessionist civil war and center-seeking civil war, which is who controls the center of government. And I think that is probably a bigger concern if the ship continues on that path. I think control over the nature of the government is probably a more likely outcome, which of course spins off into secessionist type movements as well. Long story short, all those things are bad. I have optimism that it'll go away, it'll come back, but if it doesn't, then there are limits to what the country can take.
Yeah, I hope it comes back to I'm becoming less optimistic about that, which is why we're doing the podcast, to try and talk through things, to try and, heighten people's awareness of how serious the problem is, at least in my mind. The idea that we can possibly calm the temperature by having thoughtful discussions, I think is workable. I don't know. I mean, somehow trying to get away from my side is against your side, you're evil, you're not human. Anything we can do to further that conversation, I'm hoping is going to be helpful.
Yeah, I agree with you there. That was one of the points in the book. I wrote it to be distinctly nonpartisan, and I thought that was very important. And I have to say, in a lot of my conversations with people, maybe I'm just on the lookout for it more now, but I see a lot of people who are kind of saying exactly what you're saying. This sort of, whether they are more left or more right, kind of pushing for that middle ground, understanding almost instinctively just how important it is.
So before we close out, I'd love to get your thoughts on this idea of soft secession or uncooperative federalism. So that idea of interposition or nullification, using that term loosely, and the states working together. You now have health compacts on the Northeast and on the Pacific states because of not liking where the CDC is currently going with RFK. Do you see that type of effort as calming? Because we talked before about going too far and becoming more working toward fragmentation when we're talking radical decentralization. But do you think some of this soft secession talk can actually be helpful in not fragmenting?
Yeah, so the soft secession concept, as I understand it, is basically where a political region or a state or jurisdiction kind of ignores the federal government, kind of does what it wants in a certain area, right? A certain activity. And some of these health networks that you're talking about are forms of soft secession. I mean, other examples are, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, there were whole sections of the country where marijuana just wasn't a problem. They just kind of ignored the federal government in that issue, right? That's a form of soft secession. I think within a certain limit or range, I think it's fine. And I think it's something that has existed in the United States since its inception, which is kind of like saying, we're informally not going to follow the federal government because we think it's going to work here. And it works to the extent that the federal government doesn't force the issue. Right. It's kind of like in the 90s. We're not going to go bust the people in San Francisco for smoking pot or something. Right. Not San Francisco, whatever. So I think within a certain range, it's a good way. It kind of greases the wheels of the American system. It only works, though, if what is demanded isn't something that the government can't agree to, or if the government just is too overbearing and is like, we're not going to accept it. And so there are limits to it. But there is that point you made. Can that lead to, can these organizations become the kernels of sort of secessionist ambition, these networks in the Northwest, for instance, about healthcare and stuff like that? If pushed far enough, absolutely. Sometimes it is political activities and policy complexes and stuff like that could become the base, like the underlying, architecture, if you will, scaffolding for a secessionist movement. It needs time to build. But if those things stick and they never really change, yeah, you can create secessionist energy for sure.
Okay. Well, I'd like to close out with some rapid fire questions, if you will, and then we'll finish it up here. I've really enjoyed this. All right. The most realistic, successful U.S. secession scenario by 2040 in your...
Oh, my goodness. The most realistic, successful one.
Regional, single state, or red, blue, anything you think of.
All right. I mean, this is the most likely, but in my mind is not very likely at all. But I would say some sort of breakup into about 5 or 6 independent countries. Maybe a West Coast. I talk about this in the book at points. A Grand California, that kind of is a West Coast thing. A Northeast blue state, something in the Midwest, and then a larger kind of redland, and maybe an independent Texas that's a bit separate from it. So I'll go with most likely, although not very likely, is maybe 5 independent states along those lines.
Okay. Give us a country where you think secession clearly improved things overall, and then another where it would be a prime example of how it made it worse.
Okay. I think the ones coming out of the end of communism, the Czechoslovakian Velvet Divorce, definitely. I think even though it was violent in many cases, the Yugoslav breakup led to some better functioning countries. And I should add, most countries emerging from decolonization. Where it ended up being worse, that's hard to say. But, South Sudan is one that people point to and say, this is a country that is still having all kinds of issues. Would they have been better off still with Sudan? I don't know. Probably not now that there's a civil war in Sudan. But it is a good example of where secession may not fix a lot of underlying problems.
What is the single most misused argument by American secession advocates that you wish they would just stop?
I think the single most common argument, not just used by them, but by secessionists around the world, is that they have a right to do this. And if they really want it and they have the moral purpose behind them, then it should come, right? I think my experience interacting with secessionists is that it's a very stirring process. You can really get into the cause, and it's kind of like you're joining a rebellion and you're really into it. Your brothers and sisters, I understand that. But I think that people don't understand the larger strategic setting in which these things play out for good reason. None of us have really, I doubt you've lived through a secession, right? This isn't like a divorce where you see people around you getting a divorce, you're familiar with it. Secession is a fundamentally unfamiliar thing. So people think it'll work if they just have a lot of like-minded people and a lot of hope.
Okay. Last one. Finish this sentence. The biggest misconception Americans have about national divorce and state breakup is
that it works in the same way that a marital divorce works.
Okay. Yeah, that's very good. All right, Professor Griffiths, thank you very much for being on. Very interesting. And if you could leave our viewers with where they can find more about you and your books.
Oh, sure. Yes. I have a personal website. It's ryangriffiths.com, and it lists the books that I've published. But the most recent one, which is right on this topic that you mentioned, is called The Disunited States, Threats of Secession in Red and Blue America and Why They Don't Work.
Well, thank you very much again, Professor. You have a great day.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.